all of Europe was suffocating under the weight of years of simmering tensions. Secret alliances, fierce rivalries, a frantic arms race, and bitter colonial disputes had turned the continent into a powder keg. All it needed was a single spark. That spark came on June 28, 1914, in the city of Sarajevo. A young Serbian nationalist named Gavrilo Princip assassinated Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife, Sophie. It was a shocking act of political violence that sent tremors across the continent. But here's the thing: the World War that followed wasn't an immediate, inevitable consequence of that assassination. What truly set the wheels of catastrophe in motion was a fatal combination of diplomatic failures, reckless gambles, and most critically, a letter that arrived just a little too late. After the assassination, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was consumed with rage. They were convinced that Serbia was behind the plot and were determined to punish them, to make an example out of their smaller neighbor. But Austria-Hungary, a sprawling but fragile empire, knew it couldn't act alone. It needed the full backing of its powerful ally, Germany. On July 5th, Germany gave Austria-Hungary what historians now call the blank check. It was a promise of unconditional support, a guarantee that Germany would stand by Austria-Hungary no matter what action it took against Serbia. It was the single most reckless diplomatic move of the entire crisis. Emboldened by this guarantee, Austria-Hungary set out to draft an ultimatum to Serbia. This wasn't a genuine attempt at diplomacy. It was a list of 10 demands, so harsh, so humiliating, that they were deliberately designed to be rejected. The ultimatum was delivered on July 23rd, giving Serbia just 48 hours to respond. Among the demands, it insisted that Austro-Hungarian officials be allowed to conduct their own investigation on Serbian soil, a blatant violation of Serbian sovereignty. Everyone expected Serbia to refuse, but then something surprising happened. On July 25th, the Serbian government sent its reply. It was a masterpiece of careful, conciliatory language. Astonishingly, Serbia agreed to almost all of Austria-Hungary's demands. They accepted 9 out of the 10 points, with only minor reservations about the one point that would completely compromise their national independence. It was an incredibly compliant response, a document that could have diffused the entire crisis. The Serbian government, hoping to win international sympathy and pressure Austria-Hungary to back down, didn't just send their reply to Vienna. They sent it to all the major European powers: Russia, France, Britain, and Germany. And this is where the tragedy of timing enters the story. While the response reached the Austrian government in Vienna, relatively quickly there was a critical delay in it reaching the one man who held perhaps the most power to stop the coming war. the German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Kaiser was on his annual summer vacation, sailing on his royal yacht in the North Sea. In an age of telegrams and diplomatic pouches, communication was far from instant. The full text of Serbia's incredibly conciliatory response did unreach the Kaiser until July 28th, 3 full days after it was sent. When Kaiser Wilhelm finally read Serbia's reply, he was stunned. He scribbled his reaction in the margins of the document. A brilliant performance for a time limit of only 48 hours, he wrote. This is more than one could have expected. A great moral victory for Vienna. But with it, every reason for war drops away. The Kaiser immediately understood the situation. Serbia had essentially capitulated. In his mind, the crisis was over. There was no longer any justification for war. He quickly drafted a new proposal, a plan he called the halt in Belgrade. His idea was simple. Austria-Hungary should occupy the Serbian capital, Belgrade, as a symbolic victory, a sort of pledge, and then open negotiations based on Serbia's compliance. This was the off-ramp. This was the diplomatic exit that could have prevented a continental war. But it was too late. By the time the Kaiser was reading Serbia's response and drafting his peace plan on his yacht, the gears of war were already grinding. On that very same day, July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary, having received the Serbian reply, but ignoring its compliant nature, declared war on Serbia. The hawkish military commanders and the foreign minister in Vienna had wanted war all along. And emboldened by Germany's blank check, they weren't about to let a diplomatic note stop them. Austro-Hungarian artillery began shelling Belgrade that same day. The war had begun. Even more tragically, the Kaiser's halt in Belgrade proposal, the last real chance for peace, never reached Vienna in its intended form. It was watered down and delayed by his own chancellor in Berlin, who didn't want to seem like he was betraying Germany's ally. By the time a weakened version of the proposal finally arrived, the Austrians felt they were too committed. They had already fired the first shots. There was no turning back. From that moment, the dominoes began to fall with terrifying, unstoppable speed. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of the Slavic people in Serbia, began to mobilize its massive army on July 30th. Tsar Nicholas II was hesitant, but the pressure from his military advisors was immense. He felt Russia couldn't simply stand by and watch Serbia be crushed. Germany saw Russia's mobilization as a direct threat. It issued an ultimatum to Russia: stop or face war. Russia refused. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. France, bound by a treaty with Russia, began its own mobilization. Germany, following its long-prepared Schlieffen Plan for a two-front war, didn't wait. On August 3rd, It declared war on France and immediately invaded neutral Belgium to outflank the French defenses. This act, the invasion of a small, neutral country, brought the final player into the game. Great Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality. It issued its own ultimatum to Germany: get out of Belgium. When Germany refused, Britain declared war on August 4th. Within a single week of Austria-Hungary's declaration of war on Serbia, all the great powers of Europe were at war. A conflict that could have remained a localized Balkan squabble had exploded into a continental catastrophe, the likes of which the world had never seen. The critical "what if" haunts historians to this day. What if the Kaiser had received Serbia's response a day or two earlier? What if he hadn't been on his yacht, but in Berlin, where he could have acted more decisively? What if his halt in Belgrade proposal had reached Vienna before the first shots were fired? What if the communication technology of 1914 had been just a little bit faster? Of course, the delayed letter didn't cause World War I on its own. The war was the product of decades of toxic nationalism, militarism, imperial rivalries, and a tangled web of alliances. But in that crucial knife-edge window of late July 1914, when peace and war hung precariously in the balance, the delay in communication proved fatal. It meant that the one person who might have hit the brakes, who saw a clear path to peace, was left shouting into the wind, his voice unheard until it was drowned out by the thunder of cannons. For years, 20 million deaths, the collapse of 4 empires, and the redrawing of the world map later, the Great War finally came to an end. And we are left to wonder whether a single letter, arriving just a few days earlier, could have changed the course of the 20th century. The tragedy was unjust that war came it, was that it came at a moment when it might have been avoided. If only the right message had reached the right person at the right time.